esteem. When we talk about why self-care feels almost impossible after a narcissistic relationship, we have to start with something uncomfortable, but honest. It's not that you're bad at self-care, esteem. It's that your sense of self was slowly, systematically erased. And that doesn't happen overnight. It happens quietly, incrementally, esteem. And often so subtly that you don't even notice it while you're in it. In the beginning, you probably knew yourself pretty well. You had preferences, opinions, rhythms. You knew what you liked, esteem, what tired you out, what mattered to you. But in a narcissistic dynamic, those parts of you start to get edited out. Your feelings are dismissed, esteem. Your reactions are labeled too sensitive. Your needs are inconvenient. Your boundaries are treated like personal attacks. Over time, the message becomes very clear, esteem, you are a problem when you take up space. So what do you do to survive that environment? You adapt, you minimize yourself, esteem. You start scanning the room instead of checking in with your own body. You ask, what do they need from me right now? Instead of what do I need? And that adaptation works, esteem, at least in the short term. It keeps the peace, it reduces conflict. But the long-term cost is enormous, because every time you override your self-esteem, you move one step further away from knowing who you are. This is why, after the relationship ends, people say things like, esteem, I don't even know what self-care looks like anymore. That's not a failure. That's a trauma response. Self-care requires a relationship with yourself, esteem. And narcissistic relationships are designed to break that relationship apart. Think about it. How do you care for yourself if you don't trust your own perceptions anymore, esteem? If every emotion you had was questioned, if every need was criticized, you learned to doubt your internal signals. Hunger, exhaustion, sadness, joy, those cues got overridden again and again, esteem. Eventually, the volume on your inner voice gets turned so far down that you can barely hear it. And then someone says, just listen to your body. And you think, esteem, I don't even know where to start. There's also grief here. When the relationship ends, you're not just grieving the person, you're grieving the version of yourself you lost. Esteem, the confident you, the relaxed you, the you who didn't second-guess every thought. And grief is exhausting. It doesn't pair well with bubble baths and gratitude journals. Esteem. Real self-care at this stage feels heavy because it's tied to mourning. Another piece people don't talk about enough is that narcissistic relationships often reward self-abandonment, esteem. When you were compliant, accommodating, quiet, and self-sacrificing, things went more smoothly. So now when you try to show up for yourself, it can feel foreign, esteem, almost like you're breaking an unspoken rule. Even something as simple as resting can trigger an internal alarms. You should be doing more, you're being lazy, esteem. This isn't okay, that voice isn't you, that's conditioning. And here's the paradox, self-care feels hardest precisely because you need it most, esteem. You're being asked to rebuild something foundational, your identity, at the same time that you're depleted, dysregulated, and emotionally raw. Of course it feels hard, esteem. Of course it feels awkward. Of course it doesn't come naturally yet. So if you're sitting there thinking, why can't I just take better care of myself? I want you to hear this clearly, esteem. The difficulty isn't a character flaw. It's evidence of what you endured. Your nervous system learned to survive without you being centered in your own life. Now you're learning a new skill, esteem, how to come back home to yourself. And that doesn't start with grand gestures. It starts with noticing, with pausing, with asking simple questions like, esteem, what am I feeling right now? And what would feel even slightly supportive? Reclaiming the self is not dramatic, it's repetitive, gentle, and often boring, esteem. But it's revolutionary when you've spent so long disappearing. Because the truth is, self-care isn't hard because you're broken, it's hard because you were trained to forget yourself, esteem. And remembering is the bravest work you'll ever do. Once your sense of self has been worn down, something else quietly takes its place, and that's guilt. Deep, reflexive, esteem. Almost automatic guilt. This is one of the most powerful reasons self-care feels so hard after a narcissistic relationship. You weren't just discouraged from having needs, esteem, you were trained to feel bad for having them. In a narcissistic dynamic, needs are framed as burdens. If you were tired, you were too much. If you were hurt, esteem, you were dramatic. If you wanted reassurance, you were needy. Over time, the message sinks in. Wanting anything at all makes you difficult, esteem. So you learn to preemptively shut those needs down. You stop asking. You stop expressing. Eventually, you stop noticing. What's especially damaging is that this guilt doesn't feel abusive, esteem. It feels moral. You start believing that means being low maintenance, endlessly understanding, and emotionally flexible. You pride yourself on being the one who doesn't complain, esteem, the one who can handle anything. But that identity is built on self-erasure, and the price is paid later. After the relationship ends, this conditioning doesn't just disappear. Esteem. You might finally have time to rest, but the moment you sit down, your body tightens. You feel uneasy, restless, even anxious. There's a voice that says, "You're being selfish." Esteem. Someone else needs you. You should be doing something productive. That voice can be so loud that rest feels unsafe. So instead of self-care being nourishing, esteem, it feels like a violation of an internal rule book you didn't even know you were following. This is why people often say, "I know I should take care of myself," esteem, but I just can't. It's not resistance, it's fear. Because in the past, taking care of yourself came with consequences. It led to criticism, withdrawal, rage, or emotional punishment. Esteem. Your nervous system remembers that. So even healthy behaviors can trigger shame, dread, or a sense of impending danger. There's also a painful double bind here. Esteem. You were expected to meet the narcissistic person's needs without hesitation, but your own needs were treated as optional, or worse, offensive. Esteem. That imbalance trains you to equate worth with usefulness. If you're not doing something for someone else, you feel undeserving. Self-care, which is inherently non-transactional, esteem, doesn't fit into that equation. There's no one to please, no approval to earn, so it feels empty or wrong. Many people try to fix this by forcing self-care. They schedule it, optimize it, esteem, turn it into another performance. But that often backfires because the guilt isn't about time management, it's about identity. Esteem. You're undoing a belief that says your value comes from sacrifice, and that belief can be deeply ingrained. It's also important to acknowledge the anger that sometimes hides beneath the guilt. Esteem. When you've spent years prioritizing someone else, finally choosing yourself can stir resentment, not just toward them, but toward yourself. For why did I let this happen? Esteem. Why didn't I speak up sooner? That self-blame fuels more guilt, which makes self-care feel even less accessible. It becomes a cycle. Guilt prevents self-care, esteem, and the lack of self-care deepens the guilt. Breaking this pattern doesn't mean eliminating guilt overnight. It means recognizing it as a leftover survival response, not a moral compass. Esteem. Guilt kept you safe once. It helped you avoid conflict, but it's no longer serving you. Now, it's just keeping you stuck. Real healing begins when you allow guilt to exist without obeying it. Esteem. When you rest even though the voice says you shouldn't. When you say no and survive the discomfort. When you meet your own needs without explaining or justifying them. Esteem. Each of those moments is a quiet act of rebellion against the conditioning you were given. And here's the reframe that matters most: self-care after narcissistic abuse isn't selfish, esteem. It's reparative. It's you returning what was taken. It's you saying, "I matter, even when I'm not useful to anyone else," esteem. Because the moment you stop treating your needs as something to apologize for is the moment you begin to take your life back. Even when the relationship is over, esteem. Even when the phone is quiet and the chaos has technically stopped, your body often hasn't gotten the memo. This is where another major obstacle to self-care shows up, esteem. Your nervous system is still living in survival mode, and when you're stuck in that state, self-care doesn't feel soothing, it feels unsafe. In narcissistic relationships, esteem, unpredictability is the norm. You never quite know what version of the person you're going to get, warm one moment, cold or cruel the next. That inconsistency trains your body to stay alert, esteem. You learn to watch tone shifts, facial expressions, silence. You become exquisitely attuned to threat. This isn't anxiety, it's adaptation, esteem. Your nervous system learned that vigilance was protection. So after the relationship ends, you may intellectually understand that you're safe, but your body doesn't believe it yet, esteem. When you try to slow down, rest, or be still, something feels off, your chest tightens, your thoughts race. You feel uneasy for no obvious reason, esteem. That's because stillness used to be dangerous. Calm often preceded an outburst. Silence meant something was wrong. Your body learned that relaxing was when you got blindsided. This is why traditional self-care advice can feel almost insulting at this stage. Just relax, take a deep breath, be present. For a hyper-vigilant nervous system, esteem, those suggestions can actually increase distress. When you're finally quiet, all the suppressed fear and tension rushes to the surface. So instead of feeling peaceful, you feel flooded, esteem. Many people respond to this by staying busy. Constant motion becomes a form of self-protection. If you're doing something, you don't have to feel. If you're productive, esteem, you don't have to be present. And from the outside, it can look like you're functioning just fine. But internally, you're exhausted because hyper-vigilance burns an enormous amount of energy, esteem. There's also a profound loss of internal safety. In healthy relationships, your body learns that connection equals regulation. But in narcissistic ones, connection equals danger, esteem. So even when you're alone later, your nervous system hasn't recalibrated. It doesn't know how to rest without bracing for impact. Self-care, which requires a sense of safety, esteem, feels inaccessible because safety itself feels unfamiliar. This is why people often say, I don't know how to relax anymore. It's not that you forgot how, esteem. It's that your body adapted to an environment where relaxation wasn't allowed. And now it needs time and consistency to learn something new, esteem. One of the most misunderstood parts of healing is that self-care doesn't start with calming down, it starts with stabilization, with helping the body feel just a little bit safer, esteem, a little bit more anchored. That might look like gentle movement instead of meditation, structured instead of stillness, predictability instead of spontaneity. These aren't failures of healing, esteem. They're appropriate responses to trauma. Another layer here is that hypervigilance often comes with self-monitoring. You're not just watching the world, you're watching yourself, esteem. You analyze every reaction, every feeling, wondering if you're overreacting, if you're being dramatic, if something bad is about to happen, esteem. That constant internal surveillance makes it nearly impossible to drop into rest. Self-care requires letting your guard down, and your system doesn't trust that yet, esteem. And that distrust makes sense. Trust was broken repeatedly. Your body learned that it was on its own. So now, rebuilding safety isn't about forcing relaxation, it's about proving, esteem over and over again, that nothing bad happens when you slow down, that you can rest and still be okay, that you can stop scanning and the world won't collapse. This process is slow, esteem, and it can feel frustrating. You might think, why am I still like this? It's over. But trauma doesn't operate on timelines, it operates on patterns. And patterns change through repetition, esteem, not insight alone. So if self-care feels agitating instead of calming, there's nothing wrong with you. Your nervous system is doing exactly what it was trained to do, esteem. The work now isn't to silence it, but to gently teach it something new, esteem. Because the day your body learns that peace is no longer a threat is the day self-care finally starts to feel like relief instead of risk, esteem. Another reason self-care feels so uncomfortable after a narcissistic relationship is that you were trained very effectively to put everyone else first. Not out of generosity or kindness, esteem, but out of necessity. Prioritizing others wasn't a personality trait, it was a survival strategy. And when a survival strategy becomes habitual, esteem, it doesn't disappear just because the relationship ends. In these dynamics, conflict is costly. Disagreement can lead to withdrawal, rage, stonewalling, or punishment, esteem. So you learn quickly that anticipating the other person's needs is safer than expressing your own. You become proactive in managing their moods, smoothing their frustrations, esteem, preventing their discomfort. Over time, you stop waiting to be asked, you automatically adjust. And that kind of constant other orientation reshapes how you relate to the world, esteem. The problem is that when you're always scanning for what others want, you lose access to what you want. Your attention is outward, not inward. Self-care requires inward focus, esteem. It requires asking yourself, what do I need right now? But when your nervous system has been conditioned to prioritize someone else's emotional weather, that question can feel confusing, esteem, or even irrelevant. There's also a deeper belief at play that your needs are secondary. You may intellectually know that everyone deserves care, but emotionally, esteem, you've learned that yours come last. So when you try to choose yourself, it can trigger discomfort, anxiety, or a sense that you're doing something wrong, esteem. You might feel selfish even when you're doing something completely reasonable, like taking a break or setting a boundary. Many people in this stage find themselves over-explaining, esteem. They justify rest. They apologize for needing space. They feel compelled to make their self-care palatable to others. That's a remnant of a system where your autonomy had to be negotiated, esteem. But real self-care doesn't require permission. And if it does, it's not really care, it's compliance. What makes this especially tricky is that self-abandonment was often rewarded, esteem. When you were flexible, accommodating, and self-sacrificing, things went more smoothly. You were praised for being easy, supportive, or understanding. Those labels can be intoxicating, esteem, especially when love was conditional, but they came at the cost of your own well-being. So now, when you're no longer in that relationship, there's an identity gap, esteem. If you're not the one who gives fixes and absorbs, who are you? Self-care can feel destabilizing because it requires letting go of a role that once kept you safe, esteem. It's not just a behavioral shift, it's an existential one. There's also fear. Fear that if you stop putting others first, you'll be rejected, that you'll be seen as difficult, esteem, that you'll lose connection. These fears are rooted in real experiences. When you asserted yourself in the past, it didn't go well, so your body remembers that, esteem, even if your mind knows the context has changed. Learning to center yourself again doesn't mean becoming selfish or unkind. It means rebalancing a system that was deeply skewed, esteem. It means recognizing that relationships don't thrive on self-erasure. Healthy connection allows for mutuality, not martyrdom, esteem. One of the most important parts of healing here is practicing small acts of self-prioritization without overthinking them, saying no without a backstory, resting without earning it, making choices based on your capacity rather than someone else's expectations. These moments may feel uncomfortable at first, but discomfort is not the same as danger, and it's worth saying this clearly. Choosing yourself will feel wrong before it feels right. That doesn't mean you're doing it incorrectly, it means you're undoing conditioning, You're stepping out of a pattern where your value was tied to what you provided for others. Self-care in this context isn't indulgence, it's boundary repair, It's learning to take up space without apology. It's trusting that you don't have to disappear to be loved, Because the moment you stop organizing your life around everyone else's needs is the moment you finally start living your own. Even when you understand everything we've talked about so far, your erased sense of self, the guilt around needs, the hyper-vigilance, the habit of putting others first, there can still be a confusing emotional pull that keeps you stuck, And that pull is often trauma bonding. This is one of the most misunderstood reasons self-care feels so hard, because it doesn't look like love, but it doesn't feel like freedom either, A trauma bond forms when intense emotional pain is mixed with intermittent reward. In narcissistic relationships, the harm isn't constant. If it were, leaving would be easier. Instead, there are moments of warmth, validation, charm, and connection woven in between the cruelty, neglect, or manipulation. Your nervous system doesn't register that as abuse, It registers it as relief, and relief is powerful. Over time, your brain starts associating the narcissistic person with survival. The highs feel euphoric because they interrupt the lows, And that chemical roller coaster creates attachment that is not logical, it's physiological. So even after the relationship ends, your body may still crave the very person who caused the damage. That craving can drain your emotional energy and leave very little room for self-care. This is why people often say, I know they were bad for me, but I still miss them. Or, I don't want them back, but I can't stop thinking about them. That doesn't mean you're weak, It means your nervous system got hooked on unpredictability. And when your emotional bandwidth is tied up in rumination, longing, or self-doubt, it's incredibly hard to redirect that energy toward yourself. Trauma bonding also distorts motivation. You may unconsciously believe that if you could just understand them better, heal them, or explain yourself more clearly, everything would make sense. That belief keeps you emotionally tethered. Self-care, by contrast, asks you to disengage, to stop explaining, to stop chasing closure, to turn your attention inward. And that can feel like giving up, even though it's actually choosing yourself. There's also grief embedded in trauma bonding, Not just grief for the relationship, but grief for the fantasy, the version of the relationship you hoped for, the moments where you felt seen. Letting go of that fantasy can feel devastating, And when you're grieving, self-care doesn't feel restorative, it feels hollow. Like, what's the point of taking care of myself if what I wanted still hurts this much? Another complicating factor is that trauma bonds often come with self-blame. You may judge yourself harshly for staying, for missing them, for not being over it yet, That inner criticism can be relentless. And when you're busy attacking yourself, self-care feels undeserved. You might think, I don't get to feel better yet, I should have known better. That mindset keeps you stuck in pain longer than necessary. What's important to understand is that trauma bonds don't break through inside alone, You can know all the facts and still feel the pull. Healing requires time, consistency, and often distance, emotional and physical. And during that process, your energy will fluctuate, Some days, all you can do is get through the day. That is not a failure of self-care. That is self-care at the most basic level. It's also why comparing your healing to others is so harmful. Trauma bonding recovery is not linear. There will be moments of clarity followed by moments of longing. That doesn't mean you're going backward. It means your nervous system is recalibrating. And recalibration is messy. Self-care in this phase often looks very unglamorous. It's not about feeling good. It's about reducing harm. It's about not re-engaging. It's about resisting the urge to check their social media. It's about tolerating discomfort without self-betrayal. These choices may not feel soothing, but they are deeply protective. Over time, as the bond weakens, something shifts. The emotional fog begins to lift. Your energy slowly returns, and self-care stops feeling like an obligation and starts feeling like relief. Because the moment you stop chasing the person who broke you is the moment you finally have the space to heal yourself. By the time you reach this point in the healing process, there's often a quiet but heavy realization the version of self-care you've been told about doesn't really fit you right now. And that can feel discouraging. You might think, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to. Why doesn't this feel better? The answer is that healing after a narcissistic relationship requires redefining self-care entirely, not perfecting it, esteem not optimizing it, redefining it. So much of mainstream self-care is performance-based, it's aesthetic, productivity adjacent, and often framed as a way to make yourself more efficient, esteem more attractive, more together. But after narcissistic abuse, that model doesn't work. In fact, it can reinforce the very patterns you're trying to heal: over-functioning, self-monitoring, esteem, and pressure to do it right. Real self-care in this context is not about feeling good. It's about feeling safe. It's not about improvement. It's about repair. And that's a profound shift, esteem. For many people, redefining self-care means letting go of the idea that it has to look impressive or even pleasant. Sometimes self-care is canceling plans without a dramatic reason, esteem. Sometimes it's choosing not to explain yourself. Sometimes it's allowing yourself to rest even though nothing is technically wrong. These choices may feel deeply uncomfortable at first, esteem, because they go against years of conditioning. Another critical part of redefining self-care is boundaries. Not as a concept, but as a daily practice. Boundaries are not walls, esteem. They're instructions for how to stay in relationship with yourself. Every time you honor a limit, you're sending your nervous system a message, esteem, as I will protect you now, and that consistency is what slowly rebuilds trust. Redefined self-care is also incredibly slow, and that can be frustrating, esteem, especially if you're used to pushing through, fixing, and accelerating. But trauma doesn't heal on a deadline. Trying to rush the process often leads to self-judgment, esteem, which is the opposite of care. Sometimes the most radical act is allowing healing to unfold at its own pace. This version of self-care also asks you to make room for discomfort, esteem. Saying no may feel selfish. Rest may feel unproductive. Distance may feel lonely. But discomfort is not a sign that you're doing it wrong. It's often a sign that you're doing something new, esteem. Growth rarely feels soothing in the beginning. It's also important to acknowledge that self-care after narcissistic abuse is relational. You may need safe people, structure, esteem, or professional support to help you learn what care even feels like. There is no shame in that. Healing doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means no longer doing everything alone, esteem. One of the hardest lessons here is learning to measure progress differently, not by how calm you feel, but by how often you choose yourself, not by how productive you are, esteem, but by how rarely you abandon yourself. These metrics don't show up on a checklist, but they matter far more than appearances. And here's something that often surprises people, esteem. As you redefine self-care, your tolerance for dysfunction drops. You become less willing to negotiate your well-being. This can change relationships. It can feel destabilizing, esteem. But it's also a sign that your internal compass is coming back online. Redefined self-care is not glamorous. It's repetitive. It's quiet, esteem. It's choosing yourself in moments when no one is watching. It's unlearning the belief that you have to earn rest, justify boundaries, or explain your worth. Over time, esteem. This new definition begins to feel less foreign. The guilt softens, the nervous system settles, the self becomes familiar again, esteem. And self-care stops feeling like a chore and starts feeling like a relationship, one you're finally allowed to nurture, esteem. Because healing doesn't happen when you learn how to take better care of yourself. It happens when you decide you're finally worth caring for.